Good morning. My name is Dana Sussmann, and I'm a senior forester with the Florida Forest Service. And like Joe, I do a wide variety of tasks in my job. The primary one is working with private landowners who have acreage they're managing for natural resources. But environmental education and public perception of natural resources is a strong component as well. And so having some ideas in your head about how you could present material has certainly been helpful to me as I explain to both coworkers and the general public what it is I do and why natural resource management is important. So I in my work, have become a certified arborist. The International Society of Arboriculture offers that certification. I'm a certified prescribed burn manager. And I'm also a graduate of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. At the time I went to school, we did not have a Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. I was in the Department of Agriculture, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, and forestry was a very, very small part of that. They've transitioned to something more similar to what University of Florida has, and focusing on natural resources and environmental sciences. They don't offer specifically a forestry degree like I received, but certainly for learning about forest management is a strong, is a major part of the department. The Florida Forest Service has multiple missions: fire protection and management, state lands management. We manage over 1 million acres. Private landowner assistance, where I spend a lot of my time, and then community and landowner education is everybody's task in my agency. Some of us do it more than others just based on our customers. If you should have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and hopefully we'll have a little time at the end, or else I can talk with you via email after today's training. So as Jessica said, I was able to visit the University of Central Florida Arboretum, which is on the east side of Orlando. I work in Orange, Seminole, Osceola, and Brevard counties, and the Arboretum was gracious enough to let me visit. I started putting this together in March, really right when everything seemed to close up, but we began to realize how important outdoor experiences are, and how we might be able to bring people in virtually to some of these experiences until lands open back up again to the general public. So arboretums generally are botanical gardens that are devoted to trees and help provide a place to do research, to study how trees grow, and then also how the general public and visitors interact with plant material and why it's so important for them to be able to visit places like this. The UCF Arboretum is open to students, staff, and visitors from the area, and they focus not only on trees, but also helping people learn about Florida's diverse ecosystems and the different plant life that you might find in them. So while they do have a section that's a more formal type garden, they also have an outdoor laboratory, and that's where we're going to take our hike today. They have numerous different ecosystems. We're going to focus on the first 4: scrubby flatwoods, scrub, mesic flatwoods, wet flatwoods. Then there's also a dome swamp, wet prairie, xeric hammock, and a depression marsh. So here's a view of the Arboretum and the campus and the different trails that they have. It's about 1,000 acres of the 3 different sections of the Arboretum, so not a huge area, but a lot of diversity. And so what I suggest to all of you is, wherever you end up in your career, to find these places, and they can be a wonderful way to get to know your area, get to know the different plant life, animal life, ecosystems. And it's also nice for me just to visit a college campus and remember what it was like to be in school, and also just know there's a lot of learning going on there, and people are excited about their futures. So today we're gonna focus on learning how to identify a few trees that are native to Florida and which you can easily find in the Arboretum. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the different ecosystems you will see there. Since most of you are studying natural resources, some of this may be entry level. It's also important though to get a refresher every once in a while. I certainly need it, especially with tree identification. So I mentioned there's a few ecosystems we'll focus on, and all these photos were taken at the Arboretum. They have a pretty good prescribed burning program. They also do a little bit of reforestation and some selective harvesting as they're working to restore some of the ecosystems to be more healthy and vital. The scrub, you'll notice just as we go through these photos, some of the habitats seem very lush and green. Others seem like the plants are just kind of barely getting what they need to survive. Mesic flatwoods, as our soils get a little wetter, you notice the vegetation gets more full and a little bit, maybe a little bit more variety. And then wet flatwoods, even more vegetation, shade, organic matter, and some indicator plants like ferns that will help you know where you are. So typically if we were to go out today and as the weather gets better, certainly the idea of hiking outside is more appealing. The workshops over the summertime, most of us were glad to be inside taking our virtual walk, but just a reminder of a few of the things you would take along. But today we're just kind of bringing our imagination, our senses, smell, sight, hearing, so that we can better experience this virtual hike. So as I showed you before, there's a series of trails here, and we're going to make a couple stops along the trails to talk about the trees that you might find there. The trails are pretty well marked, and that's always an important thing when you suggest for somebody to take a walk somewhere to know whether or not they're going to need some supplemental maps or the signage is good. So we're going to start at the pavilion, the nature pavilion, that is a great area to just get your group together. If you're going to do a real walk, talk a little bit about what you might see during your walk. A lot of people enjoy doing nature journaling or leaf collecting on a virtual walk, or even if you're just, you could still go outside, but you're doing a classroom setting, some way of making leaves like origami or leaf rubbings, so people would have a little bit of something to put in their nature journal. And then a couple project learning tree activities that you could either do during your walk or after your walk. The sounds around, poetry, and the diagram you see here is from poetry. It's a certain format that helps you write a poem about a specific subject matter and then name that tree. And later on, you're going to actually do a couple activities that would be applicable to a nature walk as well. So before we start walking, we want to talk a little bit about how we identify a tree and why we might want to know what kind of tree it specifically is. So dendrology, I'm not sure how many of you have had the dendrology class yet, the science of tree identification, but trees have various characteristics that help us identify what type of tree they are. And the link here at the bottom, this is a really good University of Florida IFAS publication that talks about tree identification. So some of the ways things we'll look at, characteristics to help us identify trees, are the leaf arrangement, and it can be either opposite, you see the leaves coming out of the same node on the branch, or alternate as they just go back and forth along the branch. The leaf type, are the leaves broad or needle-like? Some trees have very distinctive bark. This is from a persimmon, and it's sometimes referred to as alligator bark. Other trees, the bark is not the showiest characteristic that they have. They might have a flower that's really notable, a fruit, or seed pods. So these are the things as we work through tree identification that we'll look at. Leaf arrangement and leaf type are probably the most common ways I use to identify trees. But sometimes if it's winter and there's no leaves on the tree, or for whatever reason the leaves look similar to a different type of tree, then you might have to move on to the bark or the flowers or the fruit. So I mentioned leaf arrangement. Very few trees have the opposite leaf arrangement. Most of them have this alternate where they go back and forth. Maple, ash, dogwood are all trees that have opposites. So if you see your branch and it shows opposite leaf arrangement, the types of tree it might be are very, very limited. If you see the alternate arrangement, then you're going to have a much longer list. And today we're going to see sweet gum and loblolly bay that have alternate. Most broadleaf trees have the alternate leaf arrangement. The leaf type, broadleaves, like hardwoods, oaks, maples, hickories. Most broadleaf trees are deciduous, although there are some exceptions, especially in the southeast, where our winters are not nearly as harsh as northern climates are. Needle-like, there are softwoods, the pines, the spruces, the firs. They tend to be evergreen, but we'll see a little bit later on, there is an exception to this as well. The leaf parts can sometimes be very useful in helping us identify what type of tree it is. And this is just a basic diagram of, you have a tip, the midrib, the margin or the edge, the petiole or the stem, the way it's attached to the branch. Leaves have veins, some are easy to see, some are very faint. And then the lamina, or the area in between the veins, can sometimes be a characteristic that's prominent and helps you identify the tree. So we've left the nature pavilion, and now we're going to walk up here to the scrubby flatwoods and see what types of trees we can identify. So as we look at this picture, we see we have pine trees, and in scrubby flatwoods you would be likely to see longleaf pine and slash pine. But how are we going to know which is which? As you see from these photos, the needle-like foliage, but then this tree has bundles or fascicles of 3 needles, and this tree has bundles of 3 and bundles of 2. So as we get more familiar with pines, we would know that longleaf pine has only fascicles of 3. Its needles are going to be a little bit longer, and slash pine will have both 2s and 3s. When you're in the woods identifying trees, sometimes, especially pine trees, those needles are up high. You can't get to them. So we resort to looking at what's on the ground and picking them up and trying to identify using that. But there's always a caution that you've picked up the leaf or the needle from the tree you're actually trying to identify, and you see if you only saw 3s, you might think it was longleaf pine, but it may actually be slash pine. So that's where you might have to move on to another characteristic, the pine cones, the bark, if you can see the flowers or the new growth. Young pines, sometimes we don't have mature trees, so we have to look at the juveniles. And longleaf pine, the 2 pictures on the left, when it's young, it looks more like a clump of grass. It takes a number of years before it actually begins to produce branches. On the right, you see slash pine. They look like miniature trees from the very beginning. So knowing what juveniles look like can be helpful. So there's another caution with juveniles. Sometimes their leaves, especially broadleaf trees, might be bigger than you would see as the tree matures, because it has fewer leaves, so it needs to increase its leaf area so it can capture the sun and photosynthesize. We may also see oaks in our scrubby flatwoods, and the 2 most common would be sand live oak and live oak. And from a distance, they may look similar. Even up close, their leaves look a little bit similar, but there are definitely some differences that will help us identify them. So I talked about the leaf margin and how that may be helpful. And revolute is a term that just means the edge of the leaf is rolling under. And we see this tree seems to have a more pronounced revolution than this tree here, which has a little bit, but not nearly as much. So as we study our trees and learn more, we would see that sand live oak is the tree on the left and live oak is the tree on the right. So similar, and you would see acorns on both those trees, but as you look closer, and you notice the underside of the leaf is also a little bit different. So sometimes we have to look at more than one characteristic in order to confirm that it's what we think it is. So now we're going to move on to C, which is this area up here of the Arboretum. It's the driest, that's where the scrub is. And the plants that live here, the trees that live here have adapted to full sun, minimal soil moisture, and sometimes they just don't look quite as majestic as trees we might find in wetter flatwoods, but certainly they play an important role in wildlife habitat, in our ecosystem health. So there are some trees like sand live oak that you may find in more than one type of ecosystem. They just have the ability to adapt to a wider range of site conditions. Others, if they are not drought tolerant, would need a wetter site, and then some trees do not like real wet soil, so you would find them only in the sandier, well-drained soils. So sand pine is another type of pine we would find at the Arboretum. It has a shorter needle. You see the comparison here of longleaf, slash with the 2s and the 3s, and then sand pine with the fascicles of 2. And again, not the majestic look, but it certainly still provides many benefits to our ecosystem. We could see sand live oak again, and just a reminder that using the margin, the edge of the leaf to help with identification can be very helpful depending on the types of trees that we're looking at. There's 2 scrubbier oaks, smaller at mature size than live oak or sand live oak, the myrtle oak and the Chapman oak. And this cluster shows both of them. So from a distance, it's very difficult to tell which is which. As you get closer and look at the leaves of myrtle oak and Chapman oak, they too are very similar, but there's some difference. You see how some of these leaves tend to fold underneath, and here they seem to be flatter. Having a tree identification guide with you or some kind of key can be helpful, as it often makes you look a little more closely at some of the finer characteristics of the leaves, of the bark, of the fruit, of the flowers, so that you can make a positive identification. And this is important to know what kind of tree it is, both in rural and urban forestry, so that you're sure you're matching the type of tree to the site, or if you're purchasing plant material, that you're getting what you actually said that you had requested for order. Saw palmetto, while not a tree, can grow across a wide range of soil conditions. It's important in the fire regime of many ecosystems because it burns while it's green. So during the summertime when we have lightning strikes, saw palmetto is often the main fuel that carries the fire. And if you've had any studies yet of the role that fire plays in ecosystems, you know that there are some that without fire will transition to a totally different type of forest system. And you might lose the one that would be there if fire remained a part of the management. Xeric hammocks are often small, isolated areas that are surrounded by a different type of ecosystem, and it usually means they're either a little bit higher in elevation or a little bit lower. So the soil moisture availability has changed. At the Arboretum, this is a great place to sit and enjoy the shade. And you see here that soil moisture must be a little bit better because you have more leaf litter and it's slower to break down. So now we're going to head to the wetter part of the Arboretum, which is really the east side and then down the south side. And we should begin to see maybe a little bit different flora and more variety, more lushness in our plant material. Again, there's a few trees like slash pine and the saw palmetto that we may have seen in drier conditions, but would also do well in these wetter conditions in the music flatwoods. And we do see that there's just overall more vegetation, more shade, and more understory plants than we saw in the scrubby flatwoods and the scrub. The loblolly bay is a broadleaf tree that's evergreen, so it's one of those exceptions that has a showy flower. This little red blotch here isn't a mistake on the photo, it's actually a leaf. Loblolly bay has sometimes what's called flagging, where you see these are beginning to change color. It does that year round, and it's a kind of a quirky characteristic that can help with identification. This is a tree that you would find in our wetter sites in Florida, but not swamp, not completely wet, but certainly with better soil moisture. Another broadleaf evergreen, the Carolina cherry laurel. When I was out there in March and April, the flower buds were set but hadn't bloomed yet. So I would have not really been looking at the flowers for identification, but more at the leaf shape. This has a leaf shape very similar to laurel oak. So sometimes from a distance, you may think it's one type of tree. As you get closer and look at the leaf a little bit better, you will see that it's not, maybe not the type of tree that you thought it was. Bark can be really a distinctive characteristic on some trees. You see Carolina cherry laurel is in the Prunus genus, and they typically have what are called lenticels, or these horizontal lines on the trunk, and that can be helpful. Sometimes lichens or just air plants will adhere to the bark, and they seem to do that with some types of trees more than others. Just like live oak, you may see Spanish moss on, laurel oak you don't. So sometimes those can be characteristics not directly related to the tree itself, but could be helpful in determining what type of tree you're looking at. So now we've left this mesic area and we're going to go down into the wet flatwoods. And again, loblolly bay, while you may not see it you wouldn't see it in standing water, you certainly could see it in areas with more soil moisture than we saw in the mesic flatwoods. Indicator plants, the ferns, you see there's just overall more shade, more leaves left on the trail, and this would be a cooler place to hike. You might have a few more mosquitoes here just because of the moisture and the shade. So a few trees. I don't have a favorite tree per se, but this is certainly one that I love seeing, bald cypress. It can grow in standing water. It's a tree with needle-like leaves that is deciduous. So in the wintertime, it will lose all its leaves. The common name bald cypress stems from that. It has a very feathery foliage, and if it's allowed to grow in a more open area, you see it has a really distinct pyramidal shape. So it'll do well in standing water, but it's also fairly drought tolerant once it becomes established. Our final pine that we would see out there is pond pine. Again, fascicles of 3, but they're going to be in between the length of slash pine and sand pine. Their cones are persistent for a couple of years. So if you're continually going back to the same place, you may notice that they're just always cones in all different sizes growing on the tree. It has a unique gray looking bark, and then it also has what's called adventitious sprouting, which is the needles seemingly growing out of the branches as opposed to a smaller branch coming out of this branch. Whoops. So in this small area, to see 4 different pines is quite unique. And again, what arboretums try to do is introduce us to a good cross-section of different genus of trees. Back to the parts of the leaf to help us with our final identifications, the petiole. You'll notice here this is a reddish color as opposed to this is a greenish color. And then the leaf margin here, instead of being smooth or even revolute rolling under, we have teeth. We have some teeth here. We also have what are called lobes, where this is a simple leaf. This does have lobes on it. And these will be helpful as we identify our final two broadleaf trees. So we've got opposite leaf, alternate leaf. And if we remember back from the earlier slides, our opposite leaf trees could include dogwood or maple. And here, this is a red maple. You see the petiole is red as well, which can help us. I talked before about juvenile leaves, mature leaves. These are both from red maple, but you see that it has a very different shape and can make it more challenging to determine what kind of tree it is. But if we look at that leaf arrangement, it's going to narrow down our choices quite a bit. And here we have alternate. So we have a sweet gum. The fruit is very distinctive. If you've ever stepped on one of these in bare feet, you know that it can also be quite painful. And it's an adaptation of the tree to protect its seed. But for someone walking along in their bare feet, it kind of takes away a little of the enjoyment of your hike in the woods. So I mentioned leaf collecting before. This is something I love to do, and by the end of a walk, I often have a handful. If you can't get outdoors, doing leaf rubbings from ones you've collected previously, origami, leaf tracings, can just help put some closure to the hike that you've taken. So we're going to walk back now to the pavilion. And here you would just have a kind of a wrap up of what you saw, what you smelled, what you heard, fill in your journal. Maybe do some of these activities as people recall what they saw and smelled and heard out on the trail, and then maybe work on your poem. And can't get away from loyalty to my school. This is my Diamante poem that talks about trees and just makes you think a little bit more about what they provide to us.